Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another extensive deep dive.
It's great to be here.
It's fantastic to have you all listening. Now, before we get started, do us a quick favor, right? Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss out on these discussions.
Yeah, definitely do that.
And I'll tell you up front, if today's deep dive hooks you, and honestly, I strongly suspect it will, you are going to want to head straight over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy the ebook we're reviewing today.
Oh, absolutely.
Also, be sure to follow the author. That's at Conrad Riker at his Substack. You'll definitely want to keep up with his writing after we unpack the sheer volume of research in this one.
It is a genuinely dense, highly provocative piece of work. I mean, there's just a lot to process here.
There really is. So today we're immersing ourselves in Conrad Riker's 2025 ebook, Men Lead, Boys Learn, Restoring Balance in Education. Now, we know many of you listening are deeply concerned about the state of our modern institutions. Specifically, there's this strong and growing feeling, particularly among men's rights activists and those within the manosphere, that these foundational institutions have been, well, entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Yeah, that's the core concern we see a lot.
And this book speaks directly to that exact perspective. The foundational argument laid out here is that there is quite literally a war on boys taking place in the modern classroom.
A literal war.
Yeah, exactly. And the text meticulously traces the history of how we supposedly arrived at this point.
Right, and before we get into the weeds, those historical shifts, it is absolutely crucial that we establish the ground rules for today's deep dive.
Very important.
We are exploring some highly charged political and cultural arguments today. So I want to clearly state to you, the listener, that we are going to explore this text completely impartially.
100%.
We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author. Our goal is simply to unpack the arguments presented, analyze the historical perspectives, and break down the data.
Right, we want you to have the facts.
Exactly. So that you can thoroughly understand the core of the manosphere and men's rights discussions surrounding modern education. We are here to synthesize the material, not to validate or invalidate the underlying ideology.
Exactly. We are just the guides on this one. We take the source material, lay it out on the table, and let you figure out what to do with it.
And to give you a quick roadmap of where we are heading, we're going to start by looking at the historical roots of education and how men originally built these systems.
The foundation.
Right. Then we'll analyze the massive institutional shifts that took place, particularly around the 1970s, which fundamentally changed the landscape.
Right, the turning point.
From there, we'll examine what the author describes as the hostile environment of the modern classroom and, the psychological toll it's taking on young boys today.
Which is heavy stuff.
It is. Finally, we'll review the staggering statistics surrounding the disappearance of male teachers and break down the proposed solutions for restoring what the text calls masculine metrics of success.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at that historical foundation. The core premise we're introduced to is that men have always been at the absolute forefront of shaping educational systems.
Since the very beginning.
Right. And the argument is that this foundational reality is currently being intentionally erased by modern narratives. The text actually takes us all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome.
Which is a fascinating place to start.
It is. And what's interesting is that it doesn't just list off Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle like some dry textbook. It focuses on the environment they created.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the emphasis on the gymnasium and the Spartan models of education.
Oh, the Spartan model is intense.
Very. In these ancient societies, education was explicitly a male-dominated field, but it wasn't a passive experience. It wasn't about sitting quietly at a desk for 8 hours a day.
Right, not at all.
The Spartan model specifically combined rigorous physical training with intellectual development. The goal was to emphasize distinctly masculine virtues.
Like what, specifically?
Physical endurance, extreme self-reliance, and courage in the face of adversity. It was an active kinetic process of forging men, not just transferring data into a student's brain.
Forging men, I like that phrasing. And when the text jumps forward to the 19th and 20th century builders of the modern systems we recognize today, that same thread remains.
Yeah, the timeline jumps, but the philosophy is similar.
Exactly. Take Thomas Arnold at the Rugby School in England. He revolutionized education by making it primarily about character building and moral discipline.
Right.
It wasn't just about reading Latin. I mean, it was about learning how to take a hit on the rugby pitch, dust yourself off, and lead your peers with integrity.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, The author is contrasting the historical reality of these men with how they are remembered or misremembered today.
Oh, the Horace Mann example is wild.
It really is. Look at Horace Mann, widely known as the father of American education. Mann fought tooth and nail for universal public schooling.
Right.
Today, modern educational theory celebrates him for his progressive ideals, the concept of education as the great equalizer. But the text argues that Mann's actual leadership style, his pedagogy, was deeply masculine.
He wasn't soft about it.
Not at all. He was firm, decisive, and completely unyielding in his convictions. The argument is that modern educators completely ignore this masculine approach.
They sort of filter it out.
Exactly. Filtering Mann's legacy strictly through a modern progressive lens that strips away the grit that actually got the job done.
You see the exact same framing applied to Booker T. Washington in the book.
Oh, definitely.
When he founded the Tuskegee Institute, his entire educational philosophy for young African American boys wasn't just about liberal arts. It was built heavily around vocational training, strict discipline, and immense grueling hard work.
Hand-on work.
Yeah. He understood that education was about instilling a sense of purpose and self-sufficiency through pragmatic, masculine ideals. But again, the text argues that the grit and strictness of his methods are continually overshadowed by the more palatable, generalized idea of him being an educational pioneer.
And the erasure described here doesn't just apply to the strict, tough-as-nails disciplinarians either. It extends to the spaces we typically associate with softness.
This part genuinely surprised me.
Consider Friedrich Froebel. Most people have never heard his name, even though he literally invented the kindergarten.
I have to admit, seeing that the inventor of kindergarten was a man was genuinely surprising to me, especially given how inherently female-dominated that space is viewed today.
It is a striking contradiction to modern assumptions. Froebel created a space where young children could learn through play, exploration, and structured creativity.
Right.
But the text points out a profound irony here. His legacy is often downplayed today precisely because he was a man innovating in what modern society has rigidly deemed a feminine caregiving space.
Wow. So because he doesn't fit the modern mold.
Right. The argument suggests that because society pushes the narrative that women are the natural, exclusive experts in early childhood care, a man's foundational role in architecting that very space is quietly swept under the rug. It disrupts the narrative.
It even extends into religious education. The text highlights how medieval monks were the ones preserving human knowledge in monasteries during the Dark Ages, painstakingly copying texts.
Literally saving history.
Exactly. And it points to modern-day rabbis and imams as the transmitters of ancient wisdom and tradition. But the claim is that modern secular narratives often dismiss religious education entirely.
Yeah, they frame it poorly.
Right, framing it purely as an instrument of male oppression over women, rather than acknowledging the vital preservative role men played in passing down the collective knowledge of humanity.
But so synthesizing this historical perspective, the thesis is that from the ancient Spartans to the creators of early childhood education, men built the bedrock.
They laid the foundation.
Exactly. And the author argues that modern institutions are selectively remembering history. They celebrate the equitable outcomes these men produced while actively erasing the masculine virtues like strict discipline, firmness, and duty that were required to produce those outcomes in the first place.
Which naturally leads to the big question, right?
Sure.
If men built the foundation, when did the cracks start showing?
Right, the timeline of the shift.
The text pinpoints World War II as the initial massive catalyst for cultural change in our schools. And the demographics here are undeniable. Millions of men left their teaching positions to go fight in the war.
And a devastating number of them never returned to the classroom.
Yeah, women stepped in to fill that massive void on the home front.
And the argument is that this wasn't merely a change of the starting roster, it fundamentally shifted the underlying culture and psychology of the schools.
How so?
Well, with a predominantly female teaching force, the emphasis began to slowly move away from strict authority, rigid structure, and stoic discipline. It pivoted heavily toward empathy, nurturing, and emotional care.
Now, the author concedes that this initial shift had some benefits, but argues it began to alienate the remaining male educators who thrived in highly structured environments.
Right, the environment changed.
But the real turning point, the moment of true institutional capture, according to the text, happens in the 1970s with the rise of feminist and Marxist-adjacent ideologies in academia.
That's where the real ideological shift happens.
Right. The claim is that feminist educators explicitly set out to reshape school curricula, to reflect their ideological priorities, focusing on equal outcomes rather than meritocratic competition.
And to really understand this, we have to look at the curriculum changes specifically.
The reading list, yeah.
Exactly. The text asserts that in the zeal to promote gender equality, the system went too far and began actively sidelining male contributions. A key example given is the deliberate removal of classic literature by male authors.
Authors like Mark Twain.
Twain, Ernest Hemingway. Think about books that dealt heavily with raw masculine themes: physical conflict, solitary adventure, stoicism. The argument is that these were frequently swapped out for feminist texts or literature focused heavily on social relationships and emotional introspection.
And the book argues that this wasn't just a literary swap.
No, it was an ideological one. The text argues it immediately began to disengage young boys, who suddenly no longer saw their own natural interests, aggressive energy, or lived experiences reflected in the books they were forced to read.
It wasn't just the reading list, though. It was the structural DNA of the schools themselves. Let's talk about the massive policy shift in the United Kingdom in the 1970s.
The grammar schools.
Yeah, because this is a perfect example of what the book means by Marxist ideology creeping in. Specifically, the pursuit of equal outcomes at the expense of natural hierarchies. The UK completely dismantled its grammar school system. Now, for those who might not be familiar, these grammar schools were highly structured, highly competitive, and strictly hierarchical. You tested in, and you competed to stay at the top.
Very intense.
But they replaced them with comprehensive schools, where the goal was to mix everyone together, promote equal opportunity, and level the playing field.
And the author claims this shift was an absolute disaster for male students.
Why is that?
Because psychologically and biologically, the text argues, boys actually thrive on competition. They need clear hierarchies. They need to understand the rules of the game, where they stand in the pecking order, and exactly what friction they need to overcome to advance.
So removing the friction.
Exactly. By moving to comprehensive schools that focused on group collaboration and making sure everyone achieved roughly the same outcome, the system removed the very friction and competitive drive that keeps boys motivated.
Wow.
The data cited from the 1990s supports this timeline, showing that under this newly flattened collaborative system, girls began dramatically outperforming boys across the board in English, math, and science.
While the boys struggled.
Right. Boys became significantly more likely to act out, face expulsion, or drop out entirely.
And then we bring it over to the United States with Title IX, enacted in 1972. Title IX was designed to ensure equal opportunities for women in education, particularly in athletics.
Yeah?
On the surface, the author admits that sounds like a noble goal, but the text focuses heavily on what it calls the gender equity paradox.
And this paradox is a critical concept to grasp if you want to understand the manosphere's critique of modern policy. The argument is that the rigid implementation of Title IX, the pursuit of perfect statistical equality, resulted in the active mathematical destruction of male spaces.
Mathematical destruction.
Right, because to comply with the law and ensure that funding and participation numbers for female athletes precisely matched the males, many schools didn't just build up women's sports.
Yeah.
They simply took an axe to establish male sports programs.
The text specifically highlights the gutting of high school and collegiate wrestling, swimming, and baseball teams. The quote that really sticks out here is, quote, "A law intended to promote equality has led to the elimination of opportunities for men."
Yeah, that's a powerful statement from the book.
The overarching view presented here is that feminist pedagogy inherently prioritizes collaboration over competition and emotional safety over physical risk.
And the text argues this fundamentally disadvantages male students. It attempts to force a one-size-fits-all, female-centric learning style onto boys, entirely ignoring the biological and psychological realities of how a young male brain actually operates.
Which naturally brings us to the present day. If the curriculum was reshaped in the 70s to remove natural competition and policies dismantled male-dominated physical spaces, what does that actually look like for a 12-year-old boy sitting in a classroom today?
Well, the text paints a picture of a hostile classroom where a literal war on boys is taking place under the guise of political correctness.
Yeah, this part of the book is packed with modern examples showing how natural boyish behavior is now completely pathologized. Things that decades ago were just considered boys being boys, high physical energy, verbal assertiveness, rough and tumble play on the playground, are now labeled with the catch-all term toxic masculinity.
Right.
They're treated like a psychological disease that needs to be medicated or disciplined out of the child.
fascinating piece of evidence cited here is a study from the University of Cambridge. The researchers found that boys who exhibited higher levels of natural assertiveness were significantly more likely to be flagged by their teachers as problem students.
Let's actually stop and think about the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Assertiveness, the willingness to speak up, challenge an idea, or take the lead, is historically a foundational leadership trait.
Absolutely.
But the text argues that the modern educational system punishes this trait because it equates educational success entirely with quiet, seated compliance.
Right. Boys are naturally wired to challenge authority and explore boundaries. But when the system's only metric for a good student is someone who sits still and doesn't interrupt, male biology becomes a punishable offense.
And the anecdotes used to back up this data are honestly wild. There's a story about a middle school student in New York who was reprimanded and actually sent to mandatory sensitivity training.
For what?
What did he do? He simply expressed the opinion during a discussion that he preferred playing sports with other boys because it was more physical and competitive.
Wow.
Yeah. The school administration deemed that opinion non-inclusive and essentially treated him like he had committed a hate crime.
The author uses that specific example to argue a broader point. Schools are no longer engaging in education, but indoctrination. It is about enforcing a rigid ideological conformity.
There's another powerful story in there, too.
Yeah. From a father, a blue-collar construction worker who had to leave work and go to the principal's office because his son was facing disciplinary action.
And what was the offense?
The son used the traditional phrase, boys and girls in class. The teacher had mandated that everyone use the gender-neutral term students, and the boy slipped up.
Unbelievable.
The father's quote in the book is heartbreaking. He says, "They're trying to turn my boy into a robot. He's not allowed to be a boy anymore."
And it goes far beyond just behavioral policing in middle school. It impacts their actual adult futures. The text points to a case from California where a highly qualified male student applied for an engineering scholarship.
Oh, this one was shocking.
We're talking stellar grades, deep passion for the field, great extracurriculars. He was outright denied.
Why?
Because the scholarship was legally reserved exclusively for female applicants, part of a massive institutional effort to close the gender gap in STEM fields.
We see a similar macro-level situation detailed in Ontario, Canada. The school district there pushed massive, well-funded initiative specifically designed to boost girls' confidence and achievement in STEM.
Which sounds good on paper.
Right. And while the data showed it worked for the girls, the text highlights the shadow side of the policy. It inadvertently caused boys' academic performance in that same district to actively decline.
That's a trade-off.
The author argues this is the harsh reality of zero-sum ideological policies. When institutions hyper-focus their resources and encouragement on prioritizing one specific group, they inherently marginalize the other, leaving boys who are already struggling to fall even further behind.
The sheer psychological toll this takes is backed up by some pretty grim data. According to the Journal of Educational Psychology, male students are currently 3 times more likely than female students to be labeled as disruptive.
3 times.
Yeah. And perhaps even more concerning, a study in the Journal of Adolescent Health found that boys who feel silenced in school, who feel they can't express their natural competitiveness or their honest opinions without facing discipline, are twice as likely to experience clinical depression and anxiety.
Let's actually stop and think about that psychological toll for a second. The text gives an example of a school that implemented a policy forcing boys to share their vulnerable feelings in the middle of a math class as part of a social-emotional learning curriculum.
I remember that part.
The result was total chaos and deep disengagement from the male students. Why? Because when boys are repeatedly shamed for their natural traits, or forced to communicate in therapeutic ways that are entirely unnatural to how they socialize, they don't just act out.
They internalize it.
They internalize a deep, quiet message that they are inherently flawed, that being male is somehow wrong. So they simply check out. They disengage completely from the educational process.
It really makes you wonder about the long-term societal effects. If you're a young man sitting in that classroom and you spend 12 of your most formative years being subtly or overtly taught that your competitive drive is toxic and your natural assertiveness will get you sent to sensitivity training, how does that impact you when you finally enter the real world? Does an environment completely obsessed with ideological conformity end up crushing a young man's willingness to take risks, to start a business, or to boldly speak his mind as an adult?
It is a profound speculation. If a boy is conditioned for a decade to just keep his head down, nod along, and keep his mouth shut to avoid being labeled a problem. It stands to reason he is going to severely struggle to assert himself in a corporate boardroom
Exactly.
or to stand up and fiercely advocate for his family later in life. The text argues this isn't just bad educational policy, it is a form of societal control that is severely damaging the psychological framework of the next generation of men.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The author argues that a massive compounding factor to all of this is the sheer lack of men actually in the building to advocate for these boys or understand their behavior.
Right.
This dives into what the book calls the masculine educator gap and the massive deficit of male role models.
The statistics provided here are genuinely staggering. Back in the 1970s, men made up roughly 30% of elementary school teachers. Today, that number has plummeted to less than 10%.
Less than 10%.
Yeah. Across the entire United States public school system, from kindergarten through 12th grade, women now make up over 75% of the teaching force.
And the men who do choose to remain in education face a ridiculous amount of societal stigma. The author interviews a veteran male primary school teacher who says he is constantly mistaken for the janitor or the gym coach by visiting parents.
Wow. Just assumed to not be a teacher.
Right. Society just doesn't compute the idea of a masculine man in a nurturing primary education role anymore. And media representation makes it so much worse. Think about it on television or in movies. Male teachers are almost always portrayed in one of two extremes.
They're either completely clueless, bumbling fools being outsmarted by their students, or they are raging, tyrannical disciplinarians.
Exactly. There is almost zero cultural representation of a capable, balanced, admirable male mentor in a classroom setting.
And this lack of representation extends from the classroom directly into the home, which is a major focus of the text. It cites a pivotal study from the University of Chicago showing that boys who grow up without a father figure in the home are twice as likely to drop out of high school.
Twice as likely.
Furthermore, in the United States, men without a high school diploma earn, on average, $25,000 less per year than their peers. The economic and social ripple effects of this role model deficit are catastrophic.
But the text doesn't just present the doom and gloom, right? It provides some incredibly compelling data on what happens when men actually are present. It calls this the masculine educator effect.
Yeah, let's look at some of those examples.
Take this primary school in Manchester, England. They were struggling with massive behavioral issues, so the administration made a deliberate, bold, somewhat controversial move to actively recruit and hire more male teachers. Within a single academic year, recorded incidents of bullying dropped by nearly 40%.
40%. And we see the exact same phenomena documented in a London high school. After intentionally increasing the number of male educators on staff, overall disciplinary issues across the entire school dropped by 40%.
It's incredible.
And it's not just about keeping the boys in line behaviorally. It profoundly impacts academic outcomes. A study from the University of Bristol showed that boys in schools that had at least one male teacher per grade level achieved measurably higher standardized test scores.
I love how the book conceptualizes this. It's framed as the role model deficit. The argument is that having a male teacher isn't just about having someone to teach you algebra or history. It is fundamentally about identity formation.
Absolutely.
Boys look at men to figure out how to be men. It's an observational learning process. They need to see a man physically standing in front of them, embodying leadership, showing resilience when a lesson goes wrong, and demonstrating healthy, controlled assertiveness.
Because without that,
Right, without that physical, tangible example, they are left entirely adrift, trying to piece together masculinity from the internet or their peers.
this ties perfectly into a fascinating psychological mechanism the author calls the father feedback loop.
Explain that one.
When a father is actively engaged in a boy's academic life, whether that means sitting down to help with math homework, reading a book together, or just asking specific, challenging questions about what they learned that day, it creates a powerful cycle of positive reinforcement.
It changes the dynamic.
Completely. The boy feels seen, evaluated, and valued by the ultimate male authority figure in his life. This direct male engagement measurably boosts the boy's academic confidence.
Which motivates him.
Right, which internally motivates him to work even harder to maintain that respect and approval. It's a biological and psychological feedback loop that maternal encouragement, while valuable, simply cannot perfectly replicate for a young male.
Okay, so the text has laid out the history, the institutional capture by ideologies that favor equal outcomes, the hostile classroom environment that pathologizes male energy, and the severe lack of male role models. So, how do we fix this?
That's the big question.
The book pivots to a series of solutions aimed at reclaiming what it calls masculine metrics in education. And there are some really compelling case studies here for you to consider.
The most prominent and perhaps most controversial solution advocated for is a robust return to single-sex education.
Right.
The fundamental argument here is that pretending boys and girls learn, mature, and socialize in the exact same way is a profound disservice to both sexes. But it particularly harms boys, who generally mature slower verbally, possess higher physical energy levels, and excel in entirely different environmental structures.
The book tells the story of a kid named Jake to illustrate this.
Oh, Jake's story is a perfect example.
Jake was in a standard co-ed middle school, and he was really struggling. He was a bright kid, but he's completely disengaged. He felt constantly overshadowed by the girls in his class who naturally dominated the verbal discussions and excelled at the sit-still and collaborate projects.
Right, the environment favored them.
Exactly. Jake felt like he was always playing catch-up, always a step behind, so he just stopped trying. But then, Jake's parents made the leap and transferred him to an all-boys school.
And the transformation described was immediate. In the all-boys environment, Jake no longer felt the intense underlying social pressure of competing for validation in front of girls.
The anxiety was gone.
He wasn't paralyzed by the fear of looking foolish or saying the wrong thing in front of the opposite sex. The text notes that his grades improved dramatically, his confidence soared, and he even joined the robotics team.
Something he never would have done before.
Exactly. He was free to just be a boy, and more importantly, he was guided by male teachers who implicitly understood how to channel his specific type of kinetic competitive energy into academic pursuits.
And it's not just anecdotal stories like Jake's. The text backs this up with systemic hard data. It points to a public school in Texas that was suffering from declining test scores and terrible behavioral issues.
They took a really bold approach.
Very bold. The administration made a radical old-school decision. They separated the boys and the girls strictly for core subjects like math and science. The results were undeniable.
What did the numbers look like?
In those separated classes, the boys' test scores shot up by 20%, and disciplinary incidents among the boys dropped by an astounding 50%.
50% drop. That's
Yes.
massive.
Yeah. The principal noted that without the girls in the room, the boys were suddenly asking way more questions, taking more academic risks, and participating aggressively because the fear of social embarrassment in front of girls was completely removed.
This data perfectly illustrates what the author calls the balance beam theory.
I love this theory.
It's very intuitive. This theory posits that boys inherently thrive when they are given the freedom to test boundaries, take physical and intellectual risks, and walk the edge, provided they are simultaneously held strictly accountable for their actions when they fall. Modern co-ed schools, heavily influenced by risk-averse pedagogies, often try to remove the boundaries and the risk entirely to prioritize total safety and quiet compliance. They take the balance beam away and put everyone on the floor.
It's too safe.
The argument is that you must put the risk back in. You have to let them walk the balance beam, let them experience the thrill of potential failure, but be right there as a firm authority to correct them when they step out of line.
Another massive part of this solution involves the return of specific, hands-on extracurriculars. The author deeply laments the absolute loss of traditional shop classes, auto mechanics, and woodworking in modern schools.
They've practically vanished.
He talks about visiting a high school in California where the old, grease-stained, dirty wood shop had been completely gutted, sterilized, and converted into a pristine makerspace filled with 3D printers, laser cutters, and sewing machines.
And to be clear, the text doesn't dismiss the value of modern digital technology,
No.
but it argues that replacing a carburetor or building a structurally sound birdhouse out of raw, splintered lumber teaches a very specific type of hands-on, practical, kinetic problem-solving that dragging and dropping shapes in a 3D modeling program simply does not.
It's too abstract.
Right. Working with your hands against physical resistance teaches patience, physical resilience, and how to assert your will upon the physical world. The author views these old-school shop classes as vital, miniature rites of passage for young men.
And there's a great story about a father in Texas who noticed this exact void. His son was restless, acting out, and completely struggling with the pure academic sit-and-listen model of his high school.
So what did he do?
The father fought the local school board for months, demanding they reinstate a hands-on vocational training program. The school board fought him, but finally agreed to pilot a small program.
And it worked.
Within a single year, that vocational program didn't just succeed. It had a massive waiting list of boys desperate to get in. And the father-son was absolutely thriving, having finally found an educational metric that valued his physical competence over his ability to sit still.
What we are unpacking here is the core concept of a masculine renaissance in education. And we must be clear in reporting the text's stance. The author explicitly states, this is not about rolling back progress for girls, nor is it about dismissing the incredible achievements of female students.
Right, it's about biological reality.
Exactly. It is about recognizing harsh biological realities. The text points to endocrinological science, showing boys generally have significantly higher levels of testosterone, which directly influences their baseline energy levels, aggression, and propensity for risk-taking.
You can't just ignore that.
The argument is that treating education as a one-size-fits-all, sit still and listen model willfully ignores male biology and heavily favors female developmental timelines.
Which perfectly transitions us into the final section of the book, where the author argues that you can't just fix the math curriculum or bring back shop class, you have to look outside the traditional classroom entirely.
Looking at the community.
The focus shifts heavily to moral education, mentorship, and community action. The premise is that you have to give boys a definitive moral compass.
Exactly. The assertion is that boys desperately need clear, unyielding moral frameworks and defined rites of passage to understand what it actually means to be a good, productive man in society.
Because without them,
Right, without these rigid structures to guide their energy, the text argues they easily fall prey to the worst modern societal pitfalls. Things like the hollow pursuit of hookup culture, the paralyzing allure of instant digital gratification via video games or pornography, and a general, overwhelming sense of nihilism.
to provide this framework, the text looks to historical and religious narratives. It brings up the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Hindu text.
That was an unexpected reference.
It was. It focuses specifically on the story of the warrior prince Arjuna, who is having a profound moral crisis on the edge of a massive battlefield. He doesn't want to fight.
Right.
His charioteer, who is the Lord Krishna, doesn't validate his hesitation. Krishna doesn't tell Arjuna to embrace his vulnerability or deconstruct his royal privilege, which is the modern therapeutic language the author critiques.
He doesn't coddle him.
Instead, Krishna explicitly, firmly reminds Arjuna of his duty, his dharma as a warrior and a leader. The argument is that modern boys are starved for stories like this.
Narratives with true masculinity.
Exactly. Narratives where true masculinity isn't about suppressing emotions, but about acknowledging them and then subjugating them to honorable, purposeful, and necessary action.
The book also looks at more recent historical morality tales that have fallen out of fashion. It highlights the mythology around George Washington, the classic I cannot tell a lie story regarding the cherry tree and the unwavering stoic justice of Abraham Lincoln.
And the Boy Scouts.
Right, it even points to the foundational tenets of the Boy Scouts of America and the Scout Law, which explicitly demands traits like trustworthiness, loyalty, bravery, and reverence.
Not just outdated ideals.
The argument here is that these aren't just abstract, outdated, cheesy ideals. They are highly practical, necessary virtues that give a young boy a concrete map for how to navigate the chaos of the world.
And the text highlights modern programs that are actively trying to instill these values today. It talks about the Leader in Me program, which is based heavily on Stephen Covey's famous book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Very popular in corporate spheres, but applied to schools.
Exactly. Schools that implement this program are teaching boys specific, actionable principles of goal setting, extreme personal responsibility, and effective leadership.
And the data shows it works.
The data provided shows that boys in these specific programs dramatically improve their ability to overcome academic and personal challenges because they're being handed a framework built on a growth mindset and personal agency, rather than a modern victim mindset that tells them the system is rigged against them.
But the author does not rely solely on institutions to fix this. In fact, he strongly advocates for decentralized community action spearheaded directly by men.
The grassroots approach.
He highlights grassroots movements like the Dad University podcast, which serves to bypass the traditional educational gatekeepers and gives highly practical, unfiltered advice to fathers on how to forcefully engage in their son's education.
I love the book club example.
Oh yeah. He mentions a father in California who, frustrated with the literature curriculum, simply started a dad's book club at his son's school. He picked books with strong male protagonists and themes of adventure.
And it took off.
The club exploded in popularity and actually fostered a genuine love of reading in boys who had entirely disengaged from their regular English classes.
The author actually proposes a formal framework for this grassroots approach, calling it the father engagement spectrum. It's designed to get dads involved at every conceivable level, from organizing alternative social media groups to physically showing up at community events to enforce behavioral standards.
It's about being present.
And the mentorship results he highlights when communities do this are incredible. Look at the Boys Leadership Academy in a small Ohio town.
That was a great case study.
The local men in the community banded together to mentor these at-risk boys outside of school hours, focusing entirely on traditional masculine values, accountability, and personal responsibility. The result: the high school graduation rate for male students in that entire town increased by 25%.
25% is a massive jump. There is also a brilliant anecdote about a community theater group in Oregon.
Theater? Really?
Now, theater might not sound inherently masculine in the traditional sense, but it's about how it was utilized. The male directors used the drama workshops not just to put on plays, but to force boys to stand up, project their voices, express themselves clearly, and develop aggressive public speaking skills in a highly structured, high-pressure environment.
Oh, that makes total sense.
The text mentions a boy named Ethan who used this exact program to completely overcome a paralyzing, socially induced fear of judgment. It's a perfect example of communities creating challenging spaces for boys to face their fears, take a risk on a balance beam, and build resilience, all guided by strong adult male mentors.
This raises an important question, though. So what does this all mean as we pull this massive hour-long deep dive together?
It's a lot to process.
To synthesize the exhaustive amount of research and the highly specific perspective laid out in this text, I think we have to look at the quote the author pulls from psychologist Michael Thompson. Boys are not broken girls.
That really sums it up.
The entire thesis of this book is that the current educational system is built on the fundamentally false ideological assumption that boys and girls learn, mature, and socialize in the exact same way. And when the system treats natural, boisterous male energy as a disease to be cured or a toxicity to be eradicated, boys quite naturally drop out both literally from the school system and psychologically from society at large.
And as we conclude, I want to offer a final firm reminder of our mission here today.
Please do.
We have spent this time thoroughly exploring the author's perspective on the ideological capture of institutions and the deep, pervasive concerns held by the manosphere regarding modern education. Our goal was to impartially outline the book's core arguments, its historical claims, and its proposed solutions without bias.
We're just presenting the material.
Exactly. It is entirely up to you, the listener, to weigh this information, examine the data presented, and draw your own independent conclusions about the state of education for young men today.
Absolutely. We present the dive, we lay out the map, but you find the treasure. You have to do the critical thinking yourself.
Before we go, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on these concerns but pushes us to look into the near future.
I'm intrigued.
We are rapidly moving into a hyper-technological age where education is being pushed further and further into remote, screen-based digital environments. If the traditional school system continues to digitize, removing all physical friction and moving completely away from the tangible world, what new, radical forms of physical, hands-on, mentorship-based communities will men need to build entirely outside of the traditional system to save the next generation of boys?
Wow.
If the classroom becomes entirely virtual, where will the modern gymnasium or the modern woodshop exist?
Matt, that is a heavy, vital question for the future. If you found this deep dive fascinating, and if you want to explore these questions in this specific perspective further, please do us a huge favor. Like and subscribe to the channel right now.
It really helps.
And remember, go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books immediately to buy Conrad Riker's ebook, Men Lead, Boys Learn, Restoring Balance in Education. Dig into the data yourself. And don't forget to follow the author, at Conrad Riker, at his Substack, for more of his ongoing writings on this critical topic. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, keep digging deeper.